Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
We had Jeffrey Smith, the best-selling author on GMO foods, on us a few weeks ago. Part 2 of that interview coming up after the break. We'll continue with your phone calls as well and a smattering of other news. Got a caller from London who disagrees with me. We'll go to him. Tom from London going to the head of the line because we go to those that disagree at the head of the line. Jeffrey, before we go into a synopsis today, I want you today, and we appreciate you joining us, to just again give a big overview of what they're currently doing, what their plan is, and the health effects that we know of. And then when you come back next week, we'll go through the whole history and just, you know, for 2 hours get into a lot more detail, and then the last hour of that 2-hour interview, take calls. But first off, for folks that want to go to Infowars.com and get Seeds of Deception and, of course, the new book, Genetic Roulette, and the rest of it, describe what they're going to get in Seeds of Deception, Genetic Roulette, the difference between the two books. By the way, I've now read both of them. Incredible, even more powerful than his verbal presentation. Tell me about those. Tell me about the film and 2 audio CD set as well.
Very good. And I'll give the information about GMOs in the context of that. Seeds of Deception, I wrote that in 2003. And what it shows in a story format is how industry manipulation and political collusion, not sound science, forced these dangerous products onto the market. The FDA was basically hijacked. They put the person in charge of policy that was Monsanto's former attorney and later Monsanto's vice president, and he was in charge of the policy which stated that the agency, the FDA, was not aware of any information showing that GM foods were substantially different, and therefore no testing was necessary. Documents later made public from a lawsuit showed that that statement was a complete lie. In fact, the overwhelming consensus among the FDA's own scientists were that GMOs were inherently unsafe and could create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. Also in Seeds of Deception, I describe how efforts by the biotechnology industry had forced a 5-part news series on bovine growth hormone by Monsanto off the air, how a UC Berkeley professor was threatened by a senior Mexican government official threatening, "We know where your children go to school," to try and get them not to publish incriminating evidence. I talk about how the FDA hid information from Congress and withheld information from the consumers about a deadly epidemic traced to a genetically engineered food supplement in the 1980s. So I describe the stories of the dark underbelly of genetically engineered foods and how our information and our food supply have been manipulated. Now, I gave that book to many policymakers around the world as I traveled to 30 countries. The book has been translated into 10 languages, and I realized that it's a tall order to ask a politician to read a book. Those that did made a big impact. In fact, it was responsible for a lot of GM-free zones that started around the world. But most of the politicians just put it down. So I decided I needed a book to convey the outrageous health risks easily to busy decision makers. But it had to be in-depth enough to convince scientists and staff researchers.
Yeah, I want to stop you. I mean, they're really quick reads, but it's all scientific with a bibliography, with the data at the bottom. And so you literally get like a master's degree in this by reading the book. And like you said, it's like an executive summary, but it's also a thick book. It just goes in chapters.
Right, and that's the second book that I wrote, Genetic Roulette. The first one's a storybook. The second one is Genetic Roulette, where I worked with more than 30 scientists to document all of the known health risks. And it turns out we came up with 65. The first 20 are adverse reactions, including thousands of sick, sterile, and dead livestock, thousands of toxic and allergic reactions, damage to virtually every organ and system studied. The other 45 show that theoretical risks, things that might go wrong because of what we now know about science. But I figured that wasn't enough. If I gave that to a politician, if I gave that to a superintendent in schools, if I gave that to a well-meaning, well-thinking person, they might think, oh, I'm sure our FDA is aware of the problems and is protecting us. So I wrote a second part which showed that all of the government assessments around the world are not competent to even identify most of the health risks described in Part 1. I went even further. In Part 3, I meticulously broke out how industry-funded studies are designed to avoid finding problems, how they use older animals instead of young, more sensitive ones, how they use obsolete and obscure detection methods, faulty statistics.
Well, they also don't even do that. Like we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, they will even take Monsanto, who bought Searle's own study where all the monkeys that they give aspartame in their milk die of brain tumors, and they say, well, see, it kills them all. It means it's good. Or when they approved Prozac in the 80s, huge increase in suicide. Now they have to put it on the bottle, and then they somehow use that to get approval. Because there's a revolving door of the regulators who revolve back and forth between, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year jobs as executives in these companies. Go ahead.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. So I basically, in the second book, Genetic Roulette, it's the first time that all of the known health risks are put together. So like the huge infant mortality rate among rats, the increase in allergies in England, and the sterility of pigs and cows, the deaths among livestock, the problems of people breathing the BT or the genetically modified pollen, all the things that we know about that have been traced through either peer-reviewed published journals or medical reports, and all of the science that explains how clearly these guys are gambling with our health and are ready to dismiss our environment simply because they want to get this stuff on the market quickly to make a big buck.
Now, let's be clear. It's not just gambling. As major publications have reported, 99, the Monsanto executive, I can paraphrase, I know you've got the quote, said, look, our goal is to contaminate everything, and then you won't have a choice, and then we're going to claim ownership over everything that's contaminated because our genetics will jump out of our corn into your corn, and if there's 1% of our genetics, we own the courts, they'll rule you robbed us even though we contaminated you. And it's not gambling because they knew 25, 30 years ago that you change one gene, it changes others, creates new amino acids, new things that never existed. We know it's shrinking the livers, destroying the organs of the rats, the guinea pigs, the gerbils, the rabbits, the animals they feed it to, and your books go over all that. I mean, so now it isn't gambling. They know full well what they're doing.
You're absolutely right, and that brings us to the third item, which is that thing called the GMO Trilogy. It's got 2 DVDs plus an audio CD. The first DVD talks a lot about what you talked about in terms of the contamination, the problems in nature, the problems with agriculture. It highlights a friend of mine, Percy Schmeisser, who is a Canadian canola farmer, who was contaminated by Monsanto's canola from passing trucks bringing their canola to market.
And by the way, for those that don't know, we had him on like 5 times. He had the bills for his seeds. He wasn't growing theirs, but they would drop pesticide bombs on his property. It would kill a big area, and if they saw one living plant, they knew that it had their genetics. I mean, that is incredible.
And I'll tell you, he shared some information with me that I'll share now with your readers that might find interesting. He was at an event with his wife, and there was a guy there who had testified against him in Monsanto's trial, claiming that he had bought Monsanto's GM seeds, and Percy knew that the guy was lying, and the guy knew that the guy was lying, and they were very angry with him, and the guy went up to him and said, I want to talk to you. And so Percy actually went over to his farm to talk, and the guy said, you see that chemical there? This is allegedly. This is all allegedly. I can only say that for legally. He said, Monsanto gave me these chemicals for lying about you in court. And the guy, it turns out, died a few months later. He had liver cancer, and he appeared to be going clean by telling about how he was allegedly bribed by Monsanto for allegedly, as I'm putting this in there to cover myself legally, for allegedly perjuring himself at the court. And it turns out some other farmers locally were taken on fishing trips by Monsanto, apparently, or brought to sporting events, and where the Monsanto representatives had a chance to badmouth this farmer that was being sued by Monsanto and to try and rustle up support against Percy Schmeisser.
It's incredible, the mafia tactics that they use. Now, in the time we've got left in the short segment, any gauge, I know it's always fluctuating, on how many of the processed foods and even the processed additives that they put in things that we don't think of as highly processed have the main 7 GMO crops in them?
Well, I would say that if it's in a box and it's processed, probably 9 out of 10. I would say out of the entire supermarket, 60 to 70%, because you have a lot of whole foods from the produce section. So the reason why I say 9 out of 10, if you look at a list of ingredients, and there's a lot of them, a lot of times it's soy or corn derivatives. Dextrose, maltodextrin, high fructose corn syrup, soy lecithin, soy protein. And then there's vegetable oil. The 4 major vegetable oils in the United States are the 4 major GM crops: soy, corn, cotton, and canola. There's also the non-GM crops could be sunflower, safflower, olive, or anything else. But the major ones are genetically engineered. So I would say if you buy processed foods and it doesn't say organic and it doesn't say non-GMO, you got to read the labels and avoid those that contain the genetically engineered derivatives.